Selden, and I am a full professor at Stephen F. Austin State University. I'm an artist full-time as well, a mom, daughter, sister, friend, wife, mentor, mentee. So got a lot of categories that I balance all together. It is a hard question to answer. Where do you find your inspiration? I had some art history professors that always explained to me that it's nice to look back at art history and to look back at a person's personal life because artists are inspired by kind of everything that they interact with, and I am too. So I am inspired by just my everyday experience. I'm inspired by things that are happening socially or politically. I'm inspired by being outside. And then one of my biggest inspirations that has been harder during the pandemic has been travel. My husband and I especially have been traveling as much as we can. I always find that it really just helps me in the studio, whether it's right away or if it's 6 months later, it always kind of helps. And then recently, I've been listening to a lot of podcasts and audiobooks, and while being outside as much as possible while walking or running, and that has really helped with idea development. I listen to podcasts about music and about writing and about creative people, kind of a series of different things, and all of those things really do make their way in there. I can't usually tell maybe until hindsight how I've been inspired, but those are the main things. And then the why I make work, I am guessing that it's just something that I feel like I have to do. I haven't really ever had a time where I didn't, and if I wasn't making work, I turn into like a really cranky person. And so I don't really know how to describe it other than I kind of just have to do it. It just is one of those things that I've always been doing, and it makes me feel right. And it's an odd thing to spend your time doing, but I just feel like it's the thing that I'm meant to do. So I kind of have a couple of different parts of the creative process. The one is the idea development, and I think I enjoy that in some ways the most. And that could be in a span of 30 seconds, or it could be in a span of 6 months, where I'm really generating those ideas and thinking about what I want to make. And hopefully the idea creates the material and the process that I'm going to use. That's usually what I hope can happen. Sometimes the process and material might be what I'm working on at the time, but for the most part, I like the material to feed the idea, and then I start making. And the part of the making that I like is I like the problem solving, and I like to have to think strategically, especially whenever I'm working with non-ferrous metals. Things can melt if you don't think way ahead. And so I like that I basically am creating these ridiculous problems and then trying so hard to solve them. And I think that that's my favorite thing about making things. It's also my favorite thing about teaching, is that I basically have no idea what anybody is going to make until we get started. And that's kind of nerve-wracking a little bit, but every student has a new idea. And so then we have to figure out how to make that thing. And it's just such a cool way to show up and do your job every day, to not have any clue, except for maybe a little bit of experience with things that are parallel. So I like that about making and about teaching. So I'm so happy that you guys have been able to have Charlie on campus, and appreciate you giving him a good home. Charlie is actually based on a series that I started whenever I was working in clay and wood, and I called them flying rings. And originally I was thinking about success and failure. And so flight was the main one that I was considering, just that how many failures you have to get at least like one success. I was also thinking about potential energy and movement and the lack of mobility. So at the time, I was making toys or these jewelry pieces that would be in a gallery where you're not allowed to touch them. And then the outdoor sculpture, the propeller has the ability to move, but it doesn't have a motor. And so I think about those things, and like that when kids view my work, they will imagine the whole thing, and they can see Charlie lifting up in the air with his, tube socks and all of this stuff. And they see it all moving, and adults usually want that motor in there. And so it's kind of a fun, it's just a fun way to do those things. And then there's always joy in the flying rings, but there's always like a little bit of adult sadness, because sometimes the way that they're designed, maybe maybe their feet are extremely heavy, or like you could just imagine it would be so hard for Charlie to lift off. He has such a big Argyle sweater on that's that's like weighing him down, that it could be really hard to lift off. And so, like, I love his little, it is really Indiana based, those tube socks, kind of Indiana basketball based, that, you can imagine him just kind of like bouncing a couple times and then he's going to make it. So the Argyle is meant to be pretty cliche as far as the patterning. And I actually just Googled Argyle, and that was the exact color scheme that came up. And I like the idea. I used to be at a public park where I live, and one of my friends said that he saw it walk into school, and then one of his colleagues came into his office wearing the exact same sweater, and he was just immediately started laughing. And so I like that. Charlie is actually named after my uncle Charlie, who lives in southern Indiana, and he's just the neatest guy I know. He's always been ahead on music and culture, and so I hope that sculpture makes you feel like that when you see him. He's just like this cool guy. You want to meet him, or this cool gal. So all of the flying rings are like that. And some of them have like, I have some that look like they're stuck in a cinder block, but he has a huge propeller. So it's that same thing. And he has bent knees, where it's just this idea that times are hard right now, but I bet he's going to be able to kind of like bend his knees and get out of that cinder block. So there's a little bit of an adult and child at play there. Really, the biggest evolution was just the changing of materials and the playing with scale. And so I started in wood and clay, and they were a scale of like 2 feet tall. And then I switched back to really fine materials like mokume gane and non-ferrous metals. And I started to make small ones that would be displayed in galleries, as these kind of precious no-touch toys. And then I started making these large scale ones in fibers that were loveys, like big hugging flying rings that the propellers could still spin, and they were all soft. And then I switched to these large scale ones. And so I'm kind of always playing around with scale and material. And with that particular series, that has stayed consistent, except whenever I was in graduate school, when I thought they weren't smart enough to make, so I stopped making them. But it stayed consistent. I just gave myself a recipe to follow. With all of my other work, it's very different. It's not consistent. And so I follow kind of a series through an idea. And I think a lot about scale. I did a lot of work with installation art in galleries early on, and I think about how a human being interacts with work. I also teach metals and jewelry, and I find how important precious objects are. And I think about objects that are worn every day and the precious nature of that. And I also have really learned a lot about public sculpture in that same way, that sometimes it's nerve-wracking for somebody to enter a gallery space. But when you're out, walking your dog or with your family, you can still really enjoy public art, and it doesn't have to be intimidating. People feel like they need to have all the answers, when that's not really the intention of art. All the time, you don't have to have the answers. It's you bringing your personal experience to it. So by exploring scale, by exploring material, I feel like I really learn about how a viewer experiences work. And so that's something that's been important to the evolution of my work, trying these different things. I definitely have played around with who my viewer is. It doesn't have to be, an academic viewer only, or somebody that's studied art history their whole life. It can be anyone. So 2020 has been challenging for all of us, and I've been in the middle of that as well. I'd say that the things that have been strong about it, in my family in particular, we were fortunate enough to be able to make the decision to manage our time to take care of my daughter at home, who is 4. And I understand that not everybody was able to have that choice. So I'm very lucky for that. But the most positive thing that's happened for me is a lot of time with her. And the benefit of that from an art perspective is that she sat, at the table right next to me doing drawings, and absolutely being so much more of a creative being than myself. And so I started to look at her drawings, and I started to, really pay attention to the way that she would see the world without somebody telling her, this is what a house looks like. And those things are just critical to artists to be able to try to get back at that extremely creative zone. It also like really slowed me down. It made me make some different decisions in the way that I make things. I needed to switch to things that I could do in kind of 20-minute bursts, because I'd often be switching with my husband so that we could get our jobs and our art making, and he's an archaeologist. So it switched my working methods. And then it also, I would have been traveling. I would have been in at multiple residencies. I would have been in Finland. I can't really imagine how my work would be different, but I'm actually so grateful for the moves that have happened in the past year. And then as far as from the teaching standpoint, I've always been pretty empathetic. I'm even more so now. In art school, you get to know your students so much better. If we ask you to do a project about identity, we're going to find out a lot about a person. And so I know the students and the alumni that I have that have had major losses in their life. And I know the students that are affected every day by social injustice. And so there's things that are affecting myself and my community every single day. And sometimes I would make artwork about that just to try to get it out of my system in a way that I felt like I could. And a lot of times it's just double checking on my people. And so that would be checking with my students and just seeing, like, we had a horrible snowstorm in Texas that just shut us down in like a way that's unimaginable after growing up in Indiana and having snow. But those first questions would be like, do you have water? Do you have food? Like, I have a 4-wheel drive vehicle. We can get you water. So it's really been an amazing year, and challenging. But the good that comes out of it is that I'm so much more aware of my value systems. I'm so aware of that artists are so good at adapting. So I think in some ways we might have been able to adapt perhaps better than others. We're always used to, well, a lot of us are used to not really having much either and trying to figure it out. So I found that my students and the people that and my other fellow artists, they just kind of just kept rolling with the punches and going for it. I think we're well equipped as problem solvers and people that can critically think to adapt and to be ready for the next situation.